The Sodder Children. "1945, Christmas morning. 5 children died in a terrible house fire. The other family members had to watch in horror as the house crumbled to ashes before them. You see, the night before, since it was Christmas Eve, Jenny Sodder allowed 5 of her children to stay up late. They were playing with some toys in the living room. At 12:30 in the morning, Jenny is startled awake by the telephone ringing. When she answers it, a woman asks to speak with someone who isn't there and who Jenny doesn't even know. Laughter and the sounds of clinking glasses could be heard. Probably a party. Jenny tells the woman that she has the wrong number and hangs up the phone. Before she goes back to bed, she notices that the living room lights are still on and the curtains were left open, which was odd as the children were taught to turn off the lights and close the curtains before bed. Jenny took care of that. Then she herself went back to bed. Jenny woke again, this time at roughly 1 a.m. She heard a sound like something hitting the roof and then was rolling down off of it. Hearing nothing else, she goes back to sleep. About 30 minutes later, she awoke a third time, this time smelling smoke. She woke up her husband, George Sr., and the other children on the main floor. George tried to get to the attic, which was where the 5 children were sleeping, but the staircase was engulfed in flames. They tried to use the phone, but the line was dead, more than likely due to the fire. It was lucky that George, his wife Jenny, and their other 4 children were able to escape at all. It took quite a while for the fire department to arrive, as they were short-staffed due to the war. And when they did show up, there was nothing they could do. Once the fire was out, the search for the children's remains started. None were found. It was determined that the fire was started by an electrical short circuit in the home's wiring. It wasn't until a few days later, after George bulldozed over what was left of the house to put a memorial for his children, did they start to realize that something about this whole thing seemed off. They started to believe that the 5 children weren't even in the house during the fire. They believed that the children were probably kidnapped. What would make them think that? Well, George Sr. remembered an altercation he had back in October with an insurance salesman. The salesman warned George that his house would go up in smoke. George believed it had something to do with his vocal hate of the late dictator Mussolini. That alone was suspicious, but there were many other things that didn't make sense. If it was just an electrical fire, why were the Christmas lights still on as the house was burning? The power should have been out. When George Sr. was trying to frantically save his children, he decided to drive one of his trucks to the side of the house to climb up the attic, but it wouldn't start. In fact, neither vehicle would start. Then he was going to use the ladder that's always left on the side of the house, but it wasn't there. It was found later about 75 feet away. They also discovered that their phone line had been cut, not melted by the fire, which is what they assumed. Supposedly a man was arrested for stealing some equipment from the Sodders, and he admitted that he was responsible for cutting the wire, but he thought it was the power line, not the phone line. Yet no record of this man could be found. And that night, a bus driver claims to have witnessed what he described as balls of fire flying at the house. And when the snow melted later that year, they found a hard, dark green rubber object, reminded George of a pineapple bomb or hand grenade. And the biggest reason why they believe that their children weren't even in the fire is when Jenny spoke with an employee of a crematorium. They informed her that even if you burn a body for 2 hours at 1100 degrees Celsius or 2000 degrees Fahrenheit, there still would be bones left. Yet the search turned up no remains at all. To George and Jenny, this was enough to convince them that their children were alive, out there somewhere. Then reports of people who had actually seen the children started. One claimed that while she was watching the fire from the roadside, a car drove by, and she clearly saw some of the kids looking out the window. Another witness stated that she served them breakfast at a truck stop, and that the car they left in had Florida plates. The Sodders hired a private investigator, and he found out that the insurance salesman who threatened George was also a member of the jury who determined the fire was accidental. Now that was very suspicious, but nothing more came of it and no charges were laid. Then in 1949, George decided to have the area excavated and hired a pathologist. If his children did indeed die in that fire, he was going to find some proof. They did find some human bones, vertebrae to be exact. However, they were from a human who would have been older than any of the children who supposedly died in that fire. It was determined that the soil that George used to cover the site came from a nearby cemetery, which could explain the bone fragments. The only thing the Sodders could think of was to put up this billboard with the children's faces on it and offer a reward. Eventually, they raised the reward from $5,000 to $10,000. Many more people came forward, but sadly, none of the leads were helpful. The best evidence they received showed up in 1967. It was a letter with no return address. Inside was a picture of a young man. On the back was Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, Lil spelled L-L-I-L, boys, A90123 or 35. This is supposed to be young Louis Sodder, all grown up. I have to say I can see a resemblance, and so did George and Jenny. And those numbers at the end of the little note? George believed they were zip codes from a city located in Sicily, Italy, called Palermo. Still assuming that this all happened because of his hate towards Mussolini, they hired another investigator to look into this. But he never reported back. He just disappeared. Many have speculated that the children unfortunately did die in that awful fire. The woman who called at 12:30 in the morning was found, and she admits that it was a wrong number. Both vehicles not starting, it's quite possible that George, who was obviously and understandably in a panic, could have easily flooded the engines in his haste to save his children. The ladder that was not in its normal place could have easily been moved earlier. Maybe one of the children was playing with it and never put it back. When George bulldozed over the site and laid 5 feet of dirt on top, I'm pretty sure any evidence that may have proven that the children were in the house at that time was lost. I can't explain away the witness who claimed he saw balls of fire being thrown at the house though. Also the fact that no remains, well, of the 5 children that is, were found. And the weird mysterious letter with a picture of a grown-up Louis Sodder. It is quite possible that it wasn't Louis, but the family believed it was. George followed many leads, all the while still believing that his children never died in that fire. Right up until his death in 1969. His wife Jenny continued to look for answers into what really happened that night, but there were no more answers to find. Jenny passed away in 1989, and soon after, the family took down the old billboard. All of the remaining children, with the exception of one, firmly believed that the Sicilian mafia was trying to extort money from their father, and the 5 children were taken, possibly to Italy. No other evidence turned up to support their claims, and it's doubtful any ever will. So it's either all 5 of those children perished in that fire, or they were kidnapped, never to be seen again. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked this video, please don't forget to hit that like button and then subscribe. Once again, my name is Rick, and I'll see you next time on The Unsolved.